Ever look at a collage and think, it's kind of boring? Maybe it just feels a little too neat and static. The secret to adding movement and energy might be simpler than you think. It's all in the angle. In this video, we're breaking out of the straight-edged box and tilting things to create movement and energy in your collage. I'll show you how a simple shift in placement can make a big difference. And be warned, there's a point in the video where you'll think, oh no, it's ruined. But just stick with me. We'll get through it together. Let's dive into the art of the angle. Last summer, I was experimenting with an idea to create prints with both positive and negative elements. It produced this kind of an effect, which I really like, but I'm having some trouble using in my collage work. I was experimenting, and I just placed the bindweed across the plate without thinking about composition or how to lay the weeds out for maximum effect. Then I would take several prints. The first 3 prints were just to remove most of the background paint. Then I removed some, but not all of the weeds, and made a print where some of the weeds were white with a halo of ink around them, and some were dark. I call this a positive-negative print. These are the types of prints I'm working with today. The problem is, neither of these prints has much of a composition. I'm fooling around with a 16 by 16 inch canvas. I have done a few tall vertical pieces lately, so I'm thinking that square might be nice for a change-up. And I was almost ready to shelve these prints when I thought, how about putting them on an angle? And that made all the difference. With this one, I can already feel the diagonals tugging at the composition. And of course, this is the advantage of collage. You can push candidates around until something speaks to you. So now I have a plan to tackle the main tissues, putting them at that jaunty angle that works out so well. So next I want to pick out some papers that I can use for foundation underneath. I like to give it some color. I have a lot of scope in the color because the tissues themselves are just basically black with some anthracone blue. So, what I choose to use, I've got a lot of leeway with. I don't have to worry about avoiding certain colors. And I'd like to carry on the kind of idea of the angle in these foundation pieces as well. So I've got a few out, and I've just been kind of pushing them around to kind of see what would maybe work. And my first thought would be, this one looks really good underneath the tissue in the corner. It's the stencil that was used in this is of the same weed as in my primary tissues. So, hey, that always works. So I'm thinking that might work well to anchor that corner. And I'm thinking if I want to keep an angles on the rest, then I could look at what else might work in the corners and give me a nice pattern. So I'm looking at what tissues are the right color, the right pattern, the right texture, and where could I put them. And I'm always looking at combining colors, repeating colors. What would work that would help the design? So I kind of like where this is heading. I like some of these color combinations. This one I think is a bit weak. It doesn't quite hold up to the other, and if it's going to anchor a corner, I think it needs a little bit more oomph than that. And this is just all part of the process. I love trying these papers on and doing little auditions and seeing what might work best where. And I'm also starting to think that perhaps too many angles in the lower layer might create a bit too much of a pinwheel effect. So I'm thinking possibly that these 2 corners could be upright, and then that would allow maybe these 2 corners to stay with that idea of the angle. The other thing I really always go back to, principles of design and all that, is repetition with variation. So if I've got this here, then possibly I could work this one in somewhere. This is a little too close to that, so I'm thinking maybe it could go over here more, over on that side. And if I keep these two on angles, that kind of makes a nice diagonal through here. And then if I want to repeat this paper, perhaps just a small amount of it up in that corner, and doing a, the wee bit of the wraparound would work. This is a fun part of the whole exercise, because you get to, I call them the auditions. You get to push papers around and see what makes sense. And then once I've got something that I'm kind of liking, like I'm kind of liking this right now, then it always makes sense to go back to one of the primary tissues and see how it works over top. So you see I've got my nice diagonal that's running through there. I might want to just adjust their angles. And then I've got a nice path coming through this way as well. Of course, you have to remember that this is all going to wrap around, so it doesn't look anywhere near as bulky as it does right now. Yeah, I think that's going to work out pretty well. It's going to give me lots of light white space in here to work against with some painting and some glazing. And of course, the second tissue, I know the second tissue works well over top of this one. I've already kind of checked that out. So this is good. So on to the overnight test. I will leave this like this, and when I come back tomorrow, either it will say, yes, that's great, or needs a little bit more work. So I've got all of those papers safely adhered and wrapped around where applicable. And I'm quite pleased with them. I quite like this set of papers and the colors that are working out in here. And one of the things you can kind of tell if it's working or not is if you rotate it. And if you rotate it, and it looks good, especially if it's square like this, and it looks good in multiple directions, then you probably have a pretty solid foundation layer. So I always kind of like to give it the checkout. Often I will end up going back to my original layout, but it is nice to know that it's balanced and looking the way that I want it to. Now also, I don't want you guys to think that the previous 5.5 minutes of video, the previous segment, is something that can be done quickly. Actually determining which papers to use and where, and the size, cutting them up and trying this out, all the auditions, that took me over 2 days. And during that time, I guess it was on the second day that I actually decided to straighten up these two corners and allow these two to continue on the diagonal. So I would encourage you not to rush those types of decisions. They are pretty important, and once they're glued down, there's less recourse. So now what I want to do is paint the rest of the canvas in some paint. It's going to be pretty neutral. It's not going to be terribly exciting because my tissues, I want them to really predominate. But I would like to get some paint on this canvas before I put the next tissue on. There, okay. That's probably fine for that layer. This layer is just really to allow me to build up on that after I've got the big tissue adhered. So I've just spent a few moments laying out this tissue to where I want it. And again, you can shuffle it around. It's lovely having the ability to do that. When I was acrylic painter doing landscapes, once you started painting, you were kind of committed. But here, you can check the angle, check the lines, and of course with the tissue, I can see the underneath pattern quite clearly. So I can kind of see if I've got maybe a goofy edge that's lining up with in a way that I don't like or something like that. And I have to remember too that when I actually adhere this tissue, it's going to go a lot more transparent than what I see right now, which is one of the things that I like about this Spectra Art tissue. So I think I'm ready to go ahead and attach this tissue. And I'm just using my matte medium. Have it in a little gum container so it's easy to dip my brush in. And I'm going to make sure I've got it all smoothed out. I'm going to pull the top part back and put on a generous layer of the medium. A wide, flat, soft brush will give you the quickest results. You can just get her done, and that's always a good thing, to just not fiddle around too much. Put the tissue back out, and then I put another layer of the medium on top. This is where it starts to go really transparent. It was when there's medium underneath and there's also medium on top. I can start to see those colors from underneath come through. And as the medium dries, it will go even more transparent. So once I've got the top part adhered, I can pull it back. Get medium down the next section. Now worry about wrapping the edges later. I always like to get this top side done first. And if you've got any questions at all about, the products that I use or technique at all, just pop me a question in the comments. I like to do the comments once or twice a day. I'll go on YouTube and see the latest comments and answer them for you. So you should get an answer back to a question pretty quickly. So I'm really quite liking this one. This tissue isn't on a huge angle, but it's amazing. If I had just tried to line up the edges, I don't think I would have liked the design as much. And then once I decided to go on the angle, well, then that just informed the rest of the piece. A little bit of wrinkles in this tissue. I don't mind. I want it to look like a collage. I don't want it to be horrifically wrinkled, but I don't mind of a few character wrinkles. I've got quite a lot of character wrinkles too. There, okay. So that's looking pretty good. And like I say, when that dries, it'll be even more transparent. Then I can decide what my next step is going to be in terms of painting and glazing. So for my next step, I'm going to add paint to this. I'm going to add white paint to some of these areas which are basically negative shapes in the tissue. And that's one of the things that I liked about this tissue, was that it has both the negative shapes of the vines with a little bit of halo of the background color, and it also has positive shapes from where I pulled the vines off the plate. So I want to increase that contrast and allow it to get some depth. So I'm going to add white to some of these areas. That'll be the first thing that I'll be doing. One of the advantages of doing this is that it's going to create a layer above my foundation tissues. So the foundation tissues will now sink down a level, and the botanical tissue that I put on here will basically come up a level. And I do love layering in my prints. Makes them look a lot more interesting, I feel, than if they are just left to be flat. Overlap is one of the best ways of creating depth or a 3D effect in any kind of painting. So if you have a tree that's in front of a mountain, that's going to look more three-dimensional than if you just had a tree kind of floating in the middle of nowhere, or a mountain floating in the middle of nowhere. Now these ones down in here are tricky. I have to kind of get a handle on them before I start throwing the paint around. I like having the same plant repeated. So down here, this is the same plant as this is. So repeating it in different layers, I think, can make it quite interesting. Now, one thing as you're going along and adding paint, if you choose to do so over some of your collage, is to think about composition. How is it affecting the composition? And some of the principles of design to think about when you're looking at this would be things like balance, movement, and emphasis. So I'm just trying to bring a bit of the balance. So if I've got a heavy section here, can I offset it up there? This was a fairly large piece of tissue or of rice paper collage down here. So by putting this negative shape over top and by having this positive shape over top, that helps to just bring it perhaps a little bit more into balance, because it's never about just one little area. It's always about the whole and how does the whole play off against each other. Eye movement is another principle I like to think about. So as I am doing these different things, I'm kind of connecting pieces of the painting. So here, this line is connecting this bit and then winding up through that. So those original things that I kind of saw in the original tissue that I liked but didn't quite know how to deal with, now it's all falling into place. Some of these areas where it's going over a particularly colorful section underneath will need a second coat. The acrylic paint, because of the size of the acrylic molecule, acrylic paint isn't as opaque as, say, oil paint, which the size of the linseed molecule is quite a bit smaller. So as the water evaporates and everything sort of settles into place, I find that some of the opaque colors in acrylic tend to get a little bit on the translucent side. So giving them a second coat is just the easiest way to deal with that. It also will get rid of any extra brush strokes that I don't necessarily want. Sometimes I want brush strokes. Sometimes I want to have a smoother surface. So putting on a second coat will help with that as well. There we go. That's got that coming through quite nicely. Now the other thing that I have the option to do at this point in time is to put any glazes that I want to slightly darken some of these background areas. Now where I've already got collage tissues underneath, I think I'm fine in that. I don't really think I need any more darkness or color, but there are a few little areas that I think would benefit from a little bit. And to do that, I have to decide what color am I going to glaze it in, because I have a lot of choice. I could go with, like the Indian yellow, although that with the bluey gray is probably not going to be all that great. I could bring in a little purple here and there. So I think I'll do that. I think I'm going to start with a basic glaze of Payne's Gray, but I'm going to bring in a little bit of blue and also a little bit of the purple. And I'm going to want to make this pretty thin. Now, a glaze is not meant to have its value adjusted by adding white. It's meant to have its value adjusted by making it thinner. So you start off with a very dilute mixture, and then you can work your way up from that. You can always add more glaze. You can add a second glaze. You can darken a glaze while it's still wet. It's quite easy to go in and soften edges while you're glazing. And all I really want to do here is just pick out a few areas which could stand to have a bit more contrast. Now, if you wanted a long time to push some of these glazes around, you could certainly use glazing medium, and that would work very well. Gives you more time to play with things. You can also wipe glazes back a little bit if that makes it more interesting. And I'm also going to use a mixture of our favorite transparent red iron oxide and a little bit of the purple to neutralize it, just to kind of darken this area right here. And I'm going to rinse my brush and then kind of wash it out a little bit. Don't really want it very dark. I can bring a little bit of that warm color over to this side. And I think I can echo that down here a little bit. There. I'm quite happy with that layer. I think that I've got enough of the distinction between the tissue level, which has these white negative leaves, and the dark positive leaves. I think I've managed to sort of bring them up a little bit and submerge the other layers a little bit. And once this dries, I'll be going on to check it against my last tissue and adhere the next tissue. So we're back, and I've just spent quite a bit of time adjusting the angle and the placement of this upper tissue. I want the positive and also the new negative shapes to mesh with the lower layer and not just create total visual chaos. And I will be adding finishing touches in paint to the top of this, but you know, I still want to have a good surface to work on. So I've got some things up in here that I think will work well, especially when I add some white paint to them. I've gotten some of the darker parts of the tissue kind of off the edge so that it won't dull what I've got underneath too much. And I think I'm ready to actually commit to this and adhere it. So I'll get at that. And again, holding it down firmly with one hand means that I don't have to worry about it slipping while I'm getting my first strip of matte medium on here. A lot of times I just feel that, you know, it just has to feel right before you actually go to the point where you glue something down or add paint to it. So, you know, if it takes a while or maybe a day or two or come back to it in the morning type idea, it's better to do that than to rush something. And I always really enjoy seeing the tissue start to go transparent. And those colors, which, you know, when you're just fooling around with it, they look pretty dull underneath. The colors start to come through from below. See that little subtle bit of transparent red iron oxide? You couldn't even see that before. Uh-oh, I just ripped my tissue. This can happen. I wasn't being quite careful enough about where I was putting it, and I had too much medium on underneath when I lifted it up. So this is a little bit tricky. But with a little bit of delicate, there we go. A little bit of delicate work there. I think we managed to save that. There's one thing about it, when you get this far into a piece, you've got quite a few, hours and days, etc. invested into it, and then all of a sudden everything goes a little sideways on you. You just have to not panic and treat it gently, and you should be able to keep it from totally dissolving. But this tissue, this Spectra Art tissue, it is a little bit, it's not as strong as the wet strength tissue, so it can split if you're not careful. I definitely have a few more wrinkles than I normally would have when I lay down a tissue, and that just happens sometimes. But like I said earlier, I want this to look like a collage. If I wanted it to be a painting, I would have just painted it. There we go. I think I managed to save that. That place where it's split is not really that visible at all. And I'm going to quit dabbing at it now. The tendency is to want to keep poking at it with your brush, but all that does is create more issues. So I will leave it there. We'll see how it looks once it's dried. Well, after that little moment of chaos, I figured a trip to my happy place was in order. Luckily, our local nursery just opened for the season, so I grabbed a friend and spent some time soaking in all the greenery. A little plant therapy never hurts. Now I feel refreshed and ready to get back in the studio. So I've taken some time to take a look at this now that it's all adhered. The damage to the tissue can't really be seen so much as felt. There are a few little bumps and ridges in here, but I never mind that sort of thing. It certainly isn't going to make me abandon this piece, that's for sure. I do have this one connection here between this vine. There's a break in this dark line, but I think I can fix that with paint, or I can cover it up with paint, one of the two. So taking a look at it, I approach the end game. I approach the end game of a painting kind of gently, slowly. I think it's really important at this stage to spend a lot more time looking at it and less time actually painting it, because I find a lot of paintings are really ruined in the last little bit of painting. I find it's very easy to go too far, too quickly, and then regret something that you've created. So at this stage, I want to pick up on the really important lines that are running through this. Again, getting back to the idea of the composition. So this vine, this negative shape in here that comes through and then splits here, that to me is structurally really important. It's one of these important diagonals, and one of the reasons why I tilted the paper. This one could use with a bit of a cleanup. And then I also want to look at enhancing the darks. So particularly in the upper tissue more than the lower tissue. I kind of like the fact that there's a mid-tone in the first tissue that's kind of been buried now under this tissue. But I want to increase some of the darks here and there to find a balance. I'm not going to paint every single little bit white that was white in the second tissue, because I think that would create too much visual chaos, and I want to avoid that. But where I need to simplify something, I'm quite willing to go in and do that. I'm also going to be taking a little bit look at what to do in the background, but first I want to establish these main shapes. So I've made those changes and moved the piece into our living room. I like to see works in natural light at this stage. I see what catches my eye in a good or bad way. It's also an opportunity for my studio buddy to offer her feedback. So a few things that I noticed during my observations was that this corner is a bit weak. All of the other corners have some fairly strong elements or contrast or whatever going into them, but this one is just a little bit weaker. And I think I could strengthen that. I think there's some dark vines in here that I could create or pick up on and make stronger, and then that would just pick up that corner a little bit. The other thing that I was looking at is that this area in here is kind of blah. It's kind of dark in an unnecessary way, maybe. And also a bit over through here. So I'm going to put some white paint. I'm going to build up some white paint in patterns in the background in those sections. I don't want to compete with the white leaves, but I think it'll work out. And wherever I can accentuate any of these angles, the shapes in the background, I'm going to do that as well. A lot of finishing a painting is about adjusting emphasis and contrast, and basically pulling pieces in and out, push and pull, to make the whole thing work. So in an area like this, where I'm finding that the corner's a bit weak, it just needs a little bit something, I can increase the contrast, either by adding light paint or adding dark paint, basically just boosting it from where it is. If I look very carefully into the tissues and into the surface, I can find things in there that I can accentuate. And then that'll just do the job for me. I can just go in and make them a little bit more important. Now, while I'm doing this, it's also something that I want to think about is reinforcing the idea of the angles in this piece. So where I can make marks that go on an angle, that would be something that I'd want to do, and just basically to help follow that theme all the way through. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I like the pattern overall. This may have gotten a little bit busy up in there, but I'll take a look at that in the next couple of days and see if it needs anything else. But I'm quite happy with the angles. Pulling a little bit more of a diagonal through like that with the white areas, and also kind of coming through this way, I think just helped to pull it all together. So it's amazing what you can do when you take some pieces that maybe didn't have all that much potential on their own and just give them a bit of a tilt. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.